right, good afternoon. Welcome to Stenton's Facebook Live with Lara Kaplan from Winterthur's Objects Conservation Lab, who's been with us really all summer, on and off, working on Emlen's Shellwork, Shadowbox, Grotto, and our Colonial Dames Chapter 2 curatorial assistant, Kyla Temple, who has been doing a lot of new research and building on all the material knowledge that we're getting by having this open. So this is the first time in at least a generation, if not more, that the case with the glass, and we'll be talking about that, is off of this inner box. And so this has been just a remarkable exploration of this little world, and I hope you'll come back and see it when it's complete. And these two ladies have a lot of good things to share about their work today. So thank you for tuning in.
Yeah, so since we've had it open, one of our main things that we've been working on is we've been able to get a closer look at everything that's in there, and also doing some cleaning and reattaching shells, which has mainly been what Laura's been working on. And then behind me, you can sort of see that the primary damage that we were looking to rectify with the treatment was this crack, which had previously been mended with two little paper Band-Aids. And so this is a more total and more stable repair. Even though it's not truly invisible, it is going to be less visually obtrusive when the case is back on. So do you want to say a little bit more about what you did with the
Sure, absolutely. Fortunately, from really good documentation that people took pictures and wrote reports over the years, we know that the damage to the glass happened sometime after the 1960s. And as Kyla said, a conservator in the 1990s came in and just temporarily stabilized the glass, which kept it all together and whole until we could get to it. And so I'll move this out of the way so that you can see it a little bit better. But mending glass is really tricky because it's transparent. So any adhesive that you use has got to be very stable and strong, and also as non-yellowing as possible. And in conservation, it can be difficult to find all of those qualities in one place, but we do have one product that we use. It's called Hextol NYL1, and it's about as close as we can get to an ideal adhesive for mending glass. It's a two-part epoxy that you have to mix very precisely. And the way that I mended it is that I, first of all, very carefully cleaned the break edges, which was tricky because it was very fragile, and a lot of very fine soot had kind of sifted in over the years, so I had to go over the break several times to get it clean. And then I took little pieces of actually just Scotch tape, which sounds kind of funny, but works very well to hold everything in as good of an alignment as possible. And then I took my epoxy and I wicked it into the breaks. And it flows very slowly but surely. And once that was done, this epoxy that we used, one of its detractions, which is also can be kind of nice sometimes, but is that it's extremely slow setting. So we just had to sit and wait until it set. And then I came back another time and cleaned off all the residues. And as you can see, like Kyla said, the breaks are still visible, but with the materials we currently have available, this is about as good of a result as we can get. Another thing that made it complicated was that it seemed as if the glass didn't want to go back into perfect alignment. Perhaps it had shifted over time in its glazing material that's kind of holding it in place. But we did the best we could, and the good news now is that it's completely stable, and it'll stay really nice and together, even with movement.
And so the sort of secondary needs of this project, which have ended up constituting more time actually, was reattaching shells that had fallen. And then in the process of having this open, we also realized that the same soot that Laura was talking about that had settled on the glass also had settled on a number of the shells, likely from this being in a home in the 19th century in a space that was heated with coal. So, really the swabs and the sponges that she was using were coming up with a lot of black coal dust on it. So everything just looks a little bit more shiny now. And so what we're doing right now is Laura's in the process of reattaching some of the shells that have fallen. So if you want to talk a little bit more about the process of how you recorded the shells that have fallen, how you're figuring out where they go, and all of that.
Absolutely, yeah. And here too, we're relying on good documentation. So I'll show you kind of one technique that I've been using. Just have to open my computer here and get this ready to go. So this is the picture from the 1960s, yes, that we have. It's black and white, and somebody took it. Here you can see the crack in the glass, so we know it was there, at least since then. And it's showing the state of the shells as they were then. And then what I did was I took a picture when I first started the treatment so that you can see where everything is now. And by very carefully comparing my photo to the older photo, you can see where the losses are and what the shells would have looked like then. So I'm focusing on this area right now and trying to think, okay, well, what might have been there originally? What I can do is zoom in on this area, and you can see there are losses here. And actually, interestingly enough, we were finding that a lot of losses were happening where there are joints in the wood, which makes sense because with changes in relative humidity, because these materials are very absorbent, they expand and contract. So there'd be more movement where the joints are than in other places. So it's not really all that surprising that there would be losses happening there. So then the really cool thing that you can do is in Photoshop, which is what I'm using, you can layer these pictures over each other and then toggle back and forth so that you can see, if you kind of focus in on there, you can see that there's two shells here. So shells that had fallen, if I go back into this view, you can see here are some of the ones that had sort of fallen over the years. We very carefully documented where they had fallen so that we might have some idea of where they came from, where they were attached originally, and kept track of all of that. And what I'm doing now over here is sort of, with all the shells that fell in this area, particularly down below this little mini grotto in here in between the birds, I'm looking for shells that might fit and look the way that they do in the black and white photo. It can be a little hard to make them out. And then I can use that as a guide for reattaching. And I can show you, I can reattach a shell if you're interested. Would you like me to go ahead and do that? Okay. Yeah, maybe put that back. Okay, so I'll just show you which the shell is. It's this little guy right here. And I have deduced other clues that we use in trying to figure out where things went. Our kind of shell, the shape of the shell and the overall design scheme. We're also looking at old adhesive residues. And sometimes you can kind of match up the adhesive residue on the shell to adhesive residues on the wooden boards, which is kind of cool. It's like doing, if any of you like doing jigsaw puzzles, it's satisfying in the same way that is satisfying when you get a match there. And then here is another conservation grade adhesive. This is the one we're using here. It's a fan favorite among conservators. It's called Paraloid B72. It's just an acrylic adhesive. It's very stable and non-yellowing. It's safe to use on the shells, and it's very strong. So I feel pretty confident using it here. It's also readily reversible if we ever want to undo what we did.
And so what adhesive was Aunt Emlen using to attach these shells originally?
That is a very good question, and it's something that we would like to research further. At first, when I looked at it, I thought it might be a form of hide glue, which was one of the adhesives that would have been available to her at the time. But analysis of similar objects at Winter Tour that was done in the 90s revealed it to be some kind of like a plant resin. So we're hoping maybe we can analyze a sample of the adhesive here and get a better idea of what it is. So I'm just going to put this away. So I just applied a little bit of the adhesive. And then what I'm going to do, it's kind of tricky to get in here, but figured out which way I want to orient it. You might not be able to see it because my hand will be in the way, but I decided that it fit here where I'm putting it in. There we go, and I'm just holding it in place for a few moments. Another good thing about this adhesive is that it bonds pretty quickly, which, as you can imagine, when you're working against gravity like this, it's important to have something that's nice and tacky. And then just leave it until it sets, and then if there's any shiny residues, I can go back in and clean it up. So that's what we've been doing. It's sort of a shell-by-shell process here.
Yeah, and luckily for us, it seems like these shells don't have any additional finishes on them. There are period sources that I have found with instructions for shell work that tell people like Emlen who are making shell work objects about how to clean and polish their shells, and they suggest to rub gum arabic onto shells that are not shiny enough, but it seems that none of these shells are coated in gum arabic, and that might have complicated the cleaning and the readhesion process a bit. So, part of having it open is we've been able to take a much closer look at the materials that were used to construct it, and we found some really interesting connections actually to that same source that was saying with the instructions for shell work, particularly regarding these little coral-like objects here. They're not actually coral, so as far as we can really tell, they're bundles of thread that have been dipped in a red waxy substance. And now the recipe and instructions provided in this manual say to melt vermilion and rosin together and dip little twigs in it. So these are not twigs, they're thread. And to me, it looks a bit more waxy than just a combo of vermilion and rosin would be. So sort of we're kind of thinking that it's maybe a sealing wax type substance, but the scientists at Winter have very graciously agreed to test some samples so we can hopefully know how well it matches up to that period recipe and those instructions, which would really give us some insight into how Anne was potentially making the non-shell components of this. The source also has a recipe for the thick cement that is used on some of the flowers. So it's been interesting to be able to get a much closer look at that and sort of compare sort of what we can tell visually about that material with the ingredients listed in the primary sources. And say some more about like the where we found most of the shells falling from, aside from the cracks.
Oh, aside from the cracks, well, let's see. There were quite a few that had fallen from kind of under the stairs. And this brings up another point that I wanted to talk about. One of the most powerful things for me about working on this was realizing just how intricate and fiddly and kind of requiring a lot of contortions it is to do this kind of work. We are kind of coming to the conclusion that Anne Emlen probably had the box resting flat or at different angles while she was working on it, because otherwise it's just too difficult to get in there. But it could be that if she was working under the stairs in the front here, that maybe she wasn't able to adhere the shells in quite as well. Or another thing is that it could be that somebody came along at some point in the future and did a restoration campaign adhering shells down that were loose with a different kind of adhesive, and maybe they were having a hard time getting under there. So we did find quite a few shells just sort of in the moss and in that area.
Another exciting thing that we were able to do is that some of you who know this object may notice that the two dolls that usually are in the grotto are not currently. So we were able to actually remove them to get a closer look. And this kind of also gave us some insights into maybe the history of different interference and human interventions with the object. We originally thought that they may have been glued in because we had some trouble lifting them out. But we actually found that they were both secured into the structure of the stairs and the little sort of mossy knoll under the stairs with modern thumbtacks, so pointing towards them being anchored in place at some point in the 20th century. So this has also given us an opportunity to look a little closer at the clothing of the dolls and sort of really, we think this one got a change of clothes probably in the 19th or 20th century. We've been able to see that these dolls have slightly different constructions in their bodies. So this one only has a wax face on the front of her head and is cloth in the back, where this doll has a solid wax head and bust as well as hands, and this one doesn't have any arms. So it's been interesting to get these out and compare them now that we can look at them a little better to the examples of wax dolls that are in similar grotto work, most of them being from the Philadelphia area. So this is something that we really wanted to be able to get closer and look at, and we're really glad that they weren't glued in, and it was a matter of just figuring out the right way to mechanically get them out.
Yes, I have to say it took, we proceeded very cautiously and kind of iteratively, and we'd go in and realize that they were stuck and be like, okay, we're going to stop and consider what we're doing, and then eventually we were able to sort of figure out what was going on. And once we had gotten the smaller doll out, who originally was sitting here, then we kind of had the courage to go and lift the larger doll out from under the stairs. And it's a really good thing that we did that for a number of reasons. But for just the overall stability of the object, it was helpful to be able to go in. There were a lot of shells that had collected under both dolls, so it was really helpful to have access to those, and we wouldn't have had that if we had left the dolls in place. So although there's always a little bit of risk when you go in there and try to move things, in this case it was well worth it.
Yeah, another sort of loose piece that we found that we've been able to examine more closely that we hadn't had the opportunity to before is one of these small little animal figures that's in the sort of bottom register of the scene. And we've had a lot of internal debate about what these are made of. We've pretty much always kind of thought of them as porcelain, with just being able to see them through glass. But on closer examination, we've come to the conclusion that it's more likely that they're carved from stone, probably alabaster is one of our primary hypotheses at this point. But that's sort of opened up a whole new interesting avenue of looking into, where would these be purchased? Are these toys? Is someone carving these for her? So, this is one of the things that one of the many things that we've discovered in the process of having the grotto open that's raised more questions than it's given us answers. So, do you have any questions from the?
We have a quick tour of what we're looking at. Is it Annabelle's house?
So we don't know if it's her house. There's a very similar grotto box in the collection of Colonial Williamsburg where the house looks almost exactly the same in design and uses very similar shells. So, we've kind of always thought that there may have been some maybe aspect of a kit or the same teacher, and there are Shellwork teachers advertising in Philadelphia newspapers in the mid-18th century, as well as in other cities in the American colonies. So, and saying that they provide the materials and the instruction for Shellwork. So it's possible that those two grottos, both here and at Williamsburg, that are both from the Philadelphia area, may have someone similar at the design or supply end of things. But we've also sort of been thinking of it in relationship to other crafts and handwork that young women or women are doing in the 18th century. So, you often see houses on samplers, and they sometimes are the houses of the woman who made it, but in many cases are not. And so there's many features of this that are quite similar to needlework and samplers in a way that, I see there's this, you can kind of really see it well with it open, this motif on the side wall of the double-handled urn and flowers, which is common on needleworks relating to the Marsh School, which was a school that was primarily educating young Quaker women, and that motif shows up in a lot of quilts and samplers associated with the women who ran that school and the women who learned needlework at the school. And there's a certain linearity to the way that things are arranged, to me, that speaks a lot to sampler design. But that's something that we've really been thinking about quite a lot as we've been looking at this. And it's sort of that same principle of that repetitive, labor-intensive work that Laura was talking about, that really having to turn it and pay attention and be very purposeful in where you're putting everything. Just as you're placing every stitch, she's being very purposeful in placing every shell.
So before we do sign off, I just want to say that more research is to come. We're going to be learning things from the Winterthur Lab. And we have Paul Kalaman from the Academy of Natural Sciences coming next week to do some shell identification with us, which will reinforce some of what we know and undoubtedly he'll share new things with us as well. And in good kind of public broadcasting tradition, I'm going to say that this program has been brought to you, this especially fascinating program, has been brought to you by the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and the Decorative Arts Trust, located in Media, Pennsylvania, which has funded Kyla as one of its emerging scholars this year. And it's their generosity that has made all of this cleaning and study and stabilizing possible, so that this Grotto box can continue to live on in our Stenton context for, let's just hope no more shells fall for another 50 years.
Exactly.
But we're really, really grateful to the Trust for making this all possible. So thank you all again for tuning in, and stay tuned for more about the Grotto, as well as Kyla will have an article in the winter issue of the Decorative Arts Trust magazine. Thanks very much.